Hi Ved, how have you been? Very
Hi, bro.
strange
Hi,
times
hi,
these.
hi. Good. Confined, bro. It's been a long time since I've seen the world. So, yeah, like a lot of thoughts flowing. That's it.
Hmm.
Otherwise, it's the same.
But does like
But how?
life
Huh?
feel different at a fundamental level?
It does, but also primarily because you're conditioned to believe something's different, right? There's nothing tangible, at least at my end, that I can see changing.
Hmm.
I'm still in those same four walls. I still see the same sights outside
Hmm.
the window. Just that, like, streets are empty. But you're conditioned to believe that there's a lot of panic out there. So I don't know if I have the clarity I should be having or the kind of fear I should be having and what is the right amount of fear or clarity to have at this moment.
Yeah, that's interesting because for me it's been a fundamental
Hmm.
shift basically in terms of the kind of life I
Okay.
was living, let's say this time last month, and the kind of life I'm
Okay.
living right now. And the biggest
Hmm.
change is basically just staring out of my window because whenever I look out of my window here in my student dormitory, a month ago
Hmm.
it was bubbling with people. You would hear noises, people coming in, some people just friends chatting, might be the odd
Hmm.
scream or the odd shout, but now it's
Hmm.
absolutely silent. And when I go to the groceries to buy like things once a
Hmm.
week or twice a week, it's just
Hmm.
dystopian. Like the streets are empty, and
Hmm.
there's this feeling that everything's come to an end and there is nobody around.
Hmm.
And the interesting thing is how
Hmm.
people react when they see you coming towards them, right? I mean, it's just pedestrians
Ah.
walking along the paths
Hmm.
here at the dormitories,
Yeah.
and whenever
Hmm.
you see somebody coming close to you, there is this
Hmm.
feeling that they want to maintain that distance and they want to be wary of you. So that creates
Yeah.
a very weird
Hmm.
sensation. So the other day I was pleasantly surprised when this guy who
Hmm.
was standing at near one of those cycle stands,
Yeah.
he was standing with the
Yeah.
football and he was juggling the football, and as I was approaching him, he just gently rolled the ball to me. And it's such a simple gesture, but for me that meant a lot at times like these, because there's this
Hmm.
avoidance syndrome among the strangers, at least what I've seen so far here at
Hmm.
Sussex,
Hmm.
where they want to keep themselves distant. But this guy just rolled the ball to me, and I just rolled it back
Yeah.
to him, and we just said take care to each other, and I left. But it was like simple and sort of
Hmm.
reminders of the kind of world we seem to have left behind for the next few months, I
Ah.
suppose.
Yeah, so this guy like falls into the risk taker category these days. Like, if the people I know, if you roll a ball towards them, they'll first sanitize the ball, then they'll throw it back at you. No one, no one's going even to that level of like
Yeah.
interface or like touch with each other. So
Hmm.
that's difficult.
Yeah, yeah.
But maybe also because you're staying on your own, right? So a lot
Hmm.
of us we've stocked up on what we had to,
Hmm.
without of course like hoarding. We have a few essential services running people who are residents. So like we have these two people who help us out and they have nowhere else to go. So they couldn't return to their villages in time. Right? So
Okay.
they're living with us for the time being. And things are essentially catered for. It's a good quality time you're spending with people back at home.
Hmm.
So you're trying to just see it in a different light. But yeah, what I also do miss is the general social interaction. Like a lot of new online innovation is made up for it, but very soon I will start having cravings of going back out.
Hmm.
Like it is that breaking point will come very soon. Perhaps lesser for you because I'm getting a sense that you can still roam around campus, right?
Yeah, yeah, I can. And in fact,
Yeah,
that's in a
so
way,
that's a luxury for us. Huh?
yeah, in a way, that's also liberating because you can walk around the
Mm,
campus, and there
mm,
are these grass
mm,
slopes just outside my dormitory. So sometimes I just go for a walk,
mm.
and I'm basically the only person in sight. Like there's nobody else at all you can see
Okay.
for a good 100, 150 yards,
Mm,
right? And again, that gives a weird sensation. And
mm,
I think
mm,
the biggest factor
mm,
about times like these is that I have often wondered what it feels like to be in the midst of history, in the midst of something that is game changing in terms of the history of
mm,
the world. And yet, when it happens, you feel so
mm,
debilitated, and especially at a time like this where I wake up one day and suddenly, I'm bustling with thoughts and I want to go out and I want to meet people, I want to interact and
mm,
maybe do interviews
mm,
and stuff like that. And then it suddenly hits you that
mm,
you're in a different world now. So you have to adapt yourself to
mm,
that. And that is challenging. I find that very difficult. What about you? Do you
mm.
feel that somewhere down the line your agency
Oh.
has been taken away because of what's going on?
I do, but what struck me more is that like I am aware of a few stories which with which I have a lot of proximity to, which just stop me from thinking about my own agency being taken away. Because so I can't work from home. Like the backstory to that is why I think like this,
Hmm.
because I work in a production centric firm, right?
Yeah.
And our factories are shut, the laborers aren't at work, and so their stories are really crippling. Like their lives have been crippled because they live hand to mouth. They are yet to be introduced to the concept of savings, right?
Hmm.
And I don't think we have no clue how they're managing over there. Like we're sure the government has to and will intervene and make sure that they're lesser debts than would have been if it had been pure anarchy. But they're in very dire straits.
Yeah.
And for them, we suddenly realize how we're so unprepared to tackle this for people like them.
Hmm.
And yeah, like a lot of agencies taken away in terms of how you can be connected, right? So like I realize we take it for granted that we can be connected and express and somewhere be involved in what's happening. Like, you can't go out and protest against this, like we did with the CA and RCA, like we
Yes.
do for
Yes.
everything. Which especially like we're still fresh as students, right? I'm just 1 year
Hmm.
into work, so you just still feel that you can somehow be part of the discourse in a very tangible way. And this just introduces you to the idea that you can't always be that way.
Yeah.
So
That's true.
yeah, it does. But
Hmm.
yeah, go on, go on, go on.
One of the things that I have found very disconcerting at these times is that at a time like this,
Mm.
your idea of what it means to be human also starts changing.
Yeah.
And what led me to think about that was something I was reading online
Mm.
about this
Uh,
woman in Iran. Now, Iran is also
okay.
among those countries where the coronavirus has
Mm.
had a lot of
Yeah, 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 yeah,
impact in
yeah.
these stages already.
Mm.
And over
Mm.
there, this woman was talking about what happened when her uncle passed away. Her uncle was diagnosed with the disease,
Mm.
and within a few days, he passed away, and
Okay.
he had to be buried, right?
Okay.
Now the thing is, at a time like this, her family members, her uncle's wife, she herself, they
Mm.
couldn't get near the body, so they couldn't comfort the person while he was in his last
Yeah.
phase
Yeah. Yeah.
by not being close to him. And at the same time,
Mm.
once he had died, they couldn't touch him, they couldn't actually
Mm.
hold his body and bury it. So they had to be at a
Mm.
distance. So what that really struck me is
Mm.
grieving, which is one of the most essential
Mm.
characteristics of being human. Even
Mm.
that has
Mm.
been so drastically affected by what's going on. So
Mm.
that is something just to think about, this sort of really hits you
Mm.
because when you see all these numbers that are being thrown by the
Yeah.
websites, by whatever I'm consuming online, you get, okay,
Mm.
these many cases, these many people infected,
Mm.
this amount of
Mm.
wait for a vaccine and all of that. It becomes difficult sometimes
Mm.
to appreciate exactly what is going on, what is the true nature of the
Mm.
problem out there. Because the problem in and of itself is an invisible enemy. It's like shadow boxing. You don't know
Mm.
what you're up against. But
Yeah.
when I read something like that, it just strikes me
Mm.
that it's affecting our human fabric, redefining what it means to be
Mm.
human.
That is doing. That is doing. It's going to. So it's definitely an inflection point.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it'll happen more visibly at a macro level, in the sense that we've suddenly begun to realize that we never saw globalization for the cost it bears, because it's such an attractive concept. We never realized that a place like China or a place like a DPRK that isn't open enough about itself has so many harms attached to the kind of intercourse we're having with it.
Hmm.
And that's something we're going to fundamentally question again when like some kind of stability is restored. That's one of the questions we're going to begin asking.
So,
In the sense that we have, yeah, go on.
yeah, yeah. So, are you saying that in a sort of new
Mm.
world order that emerges after COVID-19,
Mm. Mm.
globalization could be at threat?
I don't think globalization can, as a concept, be a threat because we are a bit too dependent on it. Like we can't
Hmm.
decouple today. But yeah, there will be a significant change in the nature of globalization. I'm pretty sure. You can't, of course, like you and I can't, because we're not experts, predict like what people are going to answer these questions as.
Hmm.
But we know what questions they're going to ask, right? They're going to ask questions in terms of how okay are we with China not disclosing things that are happening inside its territory? Or like
Hmm.
how okay are we with like the kind of aid structures that exist, with there
Hmm.
being no umbrella body which literally has power, like a WHO in the powerless form it is in, is proving so ineffective in so many areas, right? How okay are we with something like that? Like,
Yes.
in places like the US, they are in absolute panic, they're in absolute chaos. The US is not supposed to be in chaos.
Yeah.
Like, you might not want US to be a hegemon, or you might indulge a lot of anti-US rhetoric, but when you see something as powerful as that crippling and crumbling, you also tend to panic in some way, because you know you're not as powerful as them, and if it's happening to them, it's more than likely to happen to you.
Yes, exactly.
So,
But
like, all.
yeah. So don't you think that there is a possibility that in a post-COVID-19 world, we'll have a more robust system that takes care of things like universal healthcare, that creates an agency or organization?
Not necessarily. So one thing we're sure of is that there are going to be major systemic changes. No? But I don't think it's necessarily going to be some kind of an altruistic or cooperative change. Maybe it will result in regional cooperation. But China being held accountable is something which we really, really do foresee. The idea of normalizing screenings, treating people who are not your immediate fraternity or not from your community with some kind of suspicion, the kind of panic that will remain, the apprehensions when you're dealing with someone from a yellow race is going to last. Like that you just can't take away for a long time. And for example, tourism is crushed in Scandinavian countries. Like, I don't see tourism reviving itself in Italy for the next few years. So there are some places where I'm sure communities are going to become more inward looking. Maybe there'll be aid facilities and aid structures which they will have to be a part of, but largely the response will be in terms of them doing a lot of introspection.
Yes, but no, do you not think that this greater conversation and a need for greater accountability will create a mechanism whereby neoliberal capitalism and everything that neoliberal capitalism has stood for, the idea of capitalist social Darwinism, the survival of the richest, so to speak, that all of these things will be questioned severely. So again, if you use, let's say, the United States as a case study, then things like politicians like Bernie Sanders are advocating for or have been advocating for, of universal healthcare, of creating that social safety net that exists in a lot of European countries. Do you not think that those things will get a resurgence in the post-COVID-19 world?
No, I'll tell you why. So that is a possibility, right? I don't think that is. It's too unidimensional to say that is a necessarily extrapolatable consequence of COVID. What I do think is going to happen is larger state interference.
Yeah.
So, like, whenever there's something which is, say, menacing your existence, or like your values, a government will necessarily tend to become more rigid. Will tend to expand, like, into personal and social relationships. Will try to go in and take over as many institutions as you can, because in the absence of normalcy, people naturally are more open to the idea of governmental interference. I think we'll stop seeing this as a binary. Governmental interference and actual freedom, we'll stop seeing it as two sides of the coin. No, we'll start realizing that we need strong governmental interference, and even whether it's right or wrong is a different thing. But we naturally will be more open to the state interfering. You will have laws which allow people to which allow governments to take up things which are otherwise in the private sector or seen under civilian liberty category, and for like larger growth. That's what China just did, no? It's using foreign factories to produce masks and ventilators and surgical equipment.
Yeah. But what you're saying isn't that also kind of giving a cue as to a world that is more increasingly authoritarian? A world where, let's say, the Chinese system kind of gets appropriated elsewhere as well. Because what you're talking about, the state interference and doing things for ostensibly utilitarian purposes, can easily create a situation where you have greater concentration of powers, where you have that autocratic rule, and where you have less civil liberties.
Not necessarily. I'll tell you why. More interference by the state or more jobs what I mean is more jobs for the state to do. Okay. It doesn't necessarily translate into very autocratic government. That's nothing to do with COVID, right? We as a society have already reached a stage where moving back into highly autocratic systems of governance, especially in like places where you and I are right now, is a very far cry from that. Like, it will be a byproduct. Like, it's an attitude, this attitude will be a byproduct of panic which we faced together. Like the fact that we've seen something in a common way. So that's why I was talking about Russia, right?
Yeah.
Stuff like famines and wars and the kind like constant invasions they had was the reason they moved towards a communist form of government, or a government that tells you that you have lesser agency because we need to protect all of you in the same way.
Hmm.
That thing is far more likely to come about, but the difference in the 21st century, I'm pretty sure, will be that capitalist forces are still very powerful.
Hmm.
So I'm not talking of a post-capitalist society. I'm talking of some kind of a renewed look at how we want to balance capitalism and the role of the state.
And with the US,
Because
of
you have,
course, yeah, and there's greater
yeah.
polarization in the US as well, because I mean, obviously in the White
Mm-hmm.
House you have a president whose sanity is doubted by
Mm-hmm.
a number of
Mm-hmm.
Democrats, and there's been that great
Mm-hmm.
partisanship. But returning to the
Mm-hmm.
India question and the sort of economic package
Mm-hmm.
that's been rolled
Oh, so
out,
no, so
yeah, yeah,
on that, I should add in the original answer. The idea that he has a fractured government, he has a fractured public mandate,
hmm,
is a major is a key thing in analyzing why the response is so muddled.
hmm,
Because Modi has a very strong mandate.
yes,
Now he doesn't have a parliament that opposes him. If he wants to pass an ordinance today and do something regarding healthcare, he might as well go ahead and do it. He has many major states under him. He has allies under him, and he's more or less an effective negotiator, or has many effective negotiators under him.
yes,
So they can manage to bring the political class together.
hmm,
I am also pretty sure
hmm,
a Manmohan Singh government wouldn't have been able to handle this as well. Because they would have just faltered at announcing a lockdown. Like look at what Imran Khan is doing.
yes.
He doesn't have the guts to declare a lockdown.
Yes, I agree, and I think the messaging from Prime Minister Modi has been fairly clear. Even in his addresses to the
Mm-hmm.
nation, he hasn't been beating around the bush. He's gotten to the point, and gotten to the point faster than, let's say, leaders like Donald Trump,
Mm-hmm.
or like in the case of the UK,
Mm-hmm.
Boris Johnson. And there has
Mm-hmm.
been no couching of words. There has been no resorting to euphemistic vocabulary. He has said what it is about, and especially I think when he said something like, these 21 days, if you are not vigilant enough, then we could go back 21 years. And I think that's the kind of messaging we need. If you compare that to, let's say, Boris Johnson saying that these are times when we could lose some of our loved ones, I think that is sort of very euphemistic framing, which and you should be clear about what you're trying to say, that you're in a situation where people will die, so you might as well just say that. The way of communication does come across in a time like this, and we've seen that Modi has done a decent job so far. But what I really want to discuss more is the economic package that's been rolled out by the Indian government, right? So you look at the measures that they have put in place, and one thing that seems to be a sort of striking lacuna in that framework is that they don't address the issue of daily wage workers, nor do they address the issue of migrant workers. So according to my understanding, and maybe there are some things I have missed out, but according to my understanding, if you are a daily wage worker, if you are a migrant worker, or if you are a rural landless laborer, that is, you don't work on your own plot of land, you don't own that plot of land, then essentially you are in a situation where you have been left in the lurch, because you can't go home right now because the means of transportation are off. So essentially you see people migrating in waves, literally walking back to where they belong. And the other issue is whatever grants have come from the government have been directed at the Jan Dhan accounts. So you've got 500 rupees that will be transferred to your Jan Dhan accounts.
For women.
Yeah,
For women only.
for women only. That is the spouses of those.
500 rupees is for women.
Yeah.
Yep.
So let's say if I am a migrant worker from Bihar, but I have been working in, let's say,
You're in Ghaziabad.
yeah, whatever.
You're in Delhi.
Yeah, in Delhi, for instance, and now and Delhi is in lockdown right now. All the means of transportation are sealed. So the only way I can go back and access that money is for me to essentially trudge back all the way on foot, and hoping that my wife somewhere in Bihar will be able to access that money through the bank account that she may or may not have. So do you not think that in some ways there has been a gross negligence towards this sector, or
Oh, it's very shoddy. No, so this is part of the larger set of people for whom the implementation of the lockdown has been very shoddy. There are people literally stranded at railway stations because you were going to go back home tonight, but like the Prime Minister came on TV and shut down the railway system at 12 o'clock.
Yes.
And if you had a morning train, like bad luck. So what they've done as a compensation is that they've made all the waiting rooms turn into some kind of boarding houses, and people can stay there indefinitely till the lockdown is enforced. But India's waiting rooms, more often than not, are pathetic places to stay in. So if you can go back, whichever city you were in and were going away from, if you have a place to go to, well and good. but a large part of India's travelers suddenly a few days ago was stuck in the railway station waiting room, and that's very tough. So what you were just talking about, migrant laborers, has just made headlines. Interestingly, there were
Yes,
large hordes of people just walking from the Delhi-Ghaziabad border back to Uttar Pradesh, like crossing over to their home because they had literally nothing else to do,
mm-hmm.
and they'd rather risk going back or rather risk catching the virus while traveling back home in such a huge group than staying on the roads and like dying of starvation for sure.
Exactly. And just like now going into a different dimension of this
Uh,
discussion, what do you
yeah.
think about the other kinds of leaders that we have seen? So, if you sort of divide the
Mm.
world leadership into three divisions,
Okay.
let's say leaders who
Mm.
have come out and who've taken responsible
Mm.
decisions, and I think you can put
Mm.
Modi in that group, right?
Yeah.
Along with people, let's say like Trudeau or some of the other countries like Merkel, which you would expect. I mean, you would expect
Partly.
like robust democracies like Germany to anyway step up to this sort of
Mm.
crisis. But
Mm.
the second
Mm.
category being, leaders who've sort of prevaricated and who've been mixed in what kind
Mm.
of messages they've given out. Johnson and
Mm.
Trump would probably fall into that category. And then if you create a
Mm.
third one of leaders who are essentially overlooking the crisis,
Mm.
or worse
Yep.
still, explicitly denying its existence. So leaders, let's say
Okay.
Lukashenko of Belarus, who's come out and said that, look,
Okay.
at a time like this, we should be more active in the
Mm.
kinds of social lives we lead, which is ludicrous. Which is why
Okay.
the Belarusian football league is
Fine.
one of the
Mm.
is the only European league that's still going on in terms of having matches,
Oh
which
yeah,
is a
I didn't
joke,
know that. Okay.
but that's how it
Okay.
is. And
Uh,
parallels to that have been seen in countries like Mexico, where
mm.
Obrador, their president, has come out and said that everything is normal. And to a certain
Mm.
extent, we've seen that with Bolsonaro as well from Brazil. So,
Mm.
what do you think is the mindset behind these leaders going ahead and saying that everything is
Mm.
normal? Is it because they feel that somehow shutting down their countries would lead to a legitimacy crisis on their part? Or is it just pure naivety?
So firstly, I will not make the distinction between the third category is fine. The first two categories are a very gray area.
Okay.
Like Trudeau, of course, has like lesser criticism. You can afford him, but there's
Hmm.
a lot of criticism to be afforded even to Modi, like we were discussing, Saudi implementation, and Angela Merkel. Like the way she has just like broken like so Germany broke the EU solidarity on this, right? Which has
Mm-hmm.
caused a big problem in terms of how we're tackling the issue as a whole. If the EU had remained in unison from the beginning, we could have seen a far more coordinated global response, which is not happening today. Like
Yes.
countries have become inward looking. So
Mm-hmm.
she was one of the leaders who early on sent out a very mixed message, and it hasn't played to anyone's benefit. Okay. Secondly, a very amateurish opinion on people like Imran Khan say and why they're refusing to shut down is that they don't have the mandate or just the political confidence.
Yeah, yeah, I get what you're saying that you don't have that
Mm-hmm.
gumption, to put it simply, to go
Mm-hmm.
ahead and shut down the
Mm-hmm.
economy and shut down the country. But what I'm saying is with leaders
Yep.
like Lukashenko and Obrador and Bolsonaro, they have the
Yeah.
political mandate. Their ego seems to
Okay.
be of a different kind, wherein they are actively going out and denying the virus being of any threat whatsoever. They can shut down the country
Mm-hmm.
if they want, and in most cases, public opinion is rapidly against them in the sense that the public are aware that this is a problem, but they are unwilling, as leaders, they're unwilling to acknowledge it. So, where do you
Mm-hmm.
think that is stemming from? And is that some ways reflective of the fact that right-wing populism has created ignorance in the highest corridors of power, which people are now going to pay for? Because
Mm-hmm.
all of these leaders are effectively populist leaders.
Not really. So first up, I'd have to say that it'll be an uninformed response,
Okay.
and it'll be just a very citizen take on it because I won't know enough on these governments. But what I can
Mm-hmm.
say is that it just reflects reflects a kind of complacence, where you're not taking an informed call on what's happening in other countries. You're not considering all factors.
Hmm.
You're not looking at how situation will pan out because you just lack basic foresight.
Um, Another thing I want to discuss is, and I think you sort of touched on it a little earlier when you were speaking about
Mm-hmm.
the absence of like a global world order in terms of a medical response.
Uh,
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 how do you deem the performance of the WHO, the World Health Organization, in this situation? And
yeah.
just before you respond, there's something that I
Mm,
want to also discuss is that there's been a series of
mm,
articles I saw on Facebook, um,
Mm-hmm.
and these articles are compiled by the New York Times that talk about how Tedros Adhanom, I guess that's the pronunciation, Tedros
Yeah.
Adhanom, whatever, the Director General of
He
the
does. You
WHO,
say that. Yeah.
yeah,
Uh,
is somebody who is basically a Chinese stooge, for want of a better term,
mm-hmm.
because the New York Times has done extensive research digging up how China
Mm-hmm.
pushed through his promotion and his
Mm-hmm.
ascension to the position of being the Director General, how he had a very
Okay.
shoddy record back in his home country as health minister, where he's believed to have
Uh,
suppressed very important information about
mm-hmm.
epidemics, and generally what his role is with respect to the way the WHO has handled the crisis,
Mm-hmm.
especially taking so much of time
Mm-hmm.
to declare this a pandemic. So the idea that
Mm-hmm.
comes across from these New York Times articles is that
Mm-hmm.
this guy essentially has been mitigating the damage in terms of reputation for China. And even if you see his statements in the media, they have been very
Yeah.
effusive and very celebratory of the kind of work China has done in terms of clamping down this
Mm-hmm.
virus. So, do you think there is a central problem at the heart of WHO and they have kind of let the world down in the way they have handled the situation?
Erdos, I mistake the name again. He is accused of right before he was elected.
Mm-hmm.
He is apparently known to have hid 3 or 4 cholera cases in his home state,
Exactly, yes,
right?
yes.
So as to like clear his record right before his election.
Hmm.
The problem with this kind of a person at the top is that it inspires a lack of confidence. But I'd I'd take like a slightly different perspective because I
Yeah.
see the WHO for what the WHO is. Because this is just a time when you are subject to higher scrutiny as someone at the helm. Now, whether it's a coincidence or whether it's problematic in actuality that this person is close enough to the Chinese administration or that his background is such, is a very different matter. And I don't think it really affects the response unless we can arrive at a conclusion as to how he's praising China for some ulterior motive.
Hmm.
WHO in itself, given the lack of power it has done a commendable job, in terms of just coordinating efforts at a time when no one expected it to.
Hmm.
So how you can judge that? Of course, there are a lot of other factors at play. If you just compare how we tackled epidemics in the past before, so I think this is the biggest epidemic we've faced. Ebola was tackled effectively enough and in time, with the biggest we faced after the WHO came into existence. Like compare our response to the
Yes,
Spanish
yes.
flu and today,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So I think that is largely a function of stuff like of organization like the WHO existing. It's
Hmm.
because you can transfer information. We as citizens are really banking on what the WHO says as an authority.
Fair enough. I agree with everything that you said, but in spite of that, I
Yeah.
think in terms of taking decisions at an earlier stage, in terms of declaring it to begin with, declaring it as a pandemic before they actually did it, because it took them
Mm-hmm.
what, about 1.5 months of the virus actually raging in China to actually declare it a
Fair.
pandemic. So I think over there the
Mm-hmm.
WHO left a lot to be desired, and depending on
Hmm.
what I read
No,
in
no,
the
no.
yeah.
A big problem there is that China didn't allow the CDC. China didn't allow the WHO to come in and check.
Hmm.
China, the one whistleblower they had, like that tank man guy from Tiananmen, they silenced him. Like we don't even know where he died through COVID or by like Xi Jinping's orders.
Yeah.
China made sure international agencies couldn't verify in time,
Hmm.
right? So like this you can't completely blame the WHO for that.
And also, I think in
Yeah.
terms of the way the WHO has been sort of looking at China in how it's tackled the virus and how
Mm-hmm.
laudatory it has been of China, whereas not necessarily highlighting what countries like, for example, South Korea or Singapore or Hong Kong have been
Mm-hmm.
able to do in terms of how quickly they have
Mm-hmm.
flattened the curve. Maybe that also tells you
Mm-hmm.
something about China's soft power and its clout in influencing the WHO.
Mm-hmm.
The other interesting thing about this, and I mean, there have been lots of discussions I've been seeing on
Yeah.
social media saying that,
Mm-hmm.
just because the virus originated in China, let's not call it the Wuhan virus or let's not call it the Chinese virus, and
The China, yeah,
that's absolutely
yeah.
fair. I mean, of course,
Mm-hmm.
that leads
Mm-hmm.
to a sort of situation where you can create fertile grounds for
Mm-hmm.
racism. But at the
Yeah,
same time,
yeah.
in spite of all these sensitivities towards
Mm-hmm.
not
Mm-hmm.
flaring up racist debates, what is
Mm-hmm.
also important to
Yeah.
understand is that the virus spreading to the world in the way it has is largely
Mm-hmm.
a failure of the Chinese authorities in terms of their structure, their autocratic structure, their channels of information not nearly being robust enough. And I think I've been reading stuff, I'm not sure how credible they are, but again, there is no smoke without fire, in the sense that Chinese authorities in the first few months were reluctant to bring it up to Xi Jinping because they thought that it would essentially lead to a crisis of legitimacy. They were too afraid to tell him that, look, something is wrong. It's a bit like, I mean, kind of throwback to what happened in Chernobyl, but they did not want to tell the top brass of leadership that, look, something is wrong and we need to address it. So I think as a society, especially a neighboring country of China in India, we need to realize what these autocratic mechanisms are doing, and the fact that what China has created is essentially largely of its own doing. I mean, yes, let's not debate about whether this virus originated by someone having a bat, or let's not talk about the labelings of this and what the implications are. But the fact of the matter is, a Chinese system that was more transparent and more responsible could have significantly ameliorated the world situation had it just taken those steps to be better guarded as a political system. So I think that there needs to be a calling out of China on that account as well.
So that's just expecting too much, like China and transparency is just expecting too much. But as in terms of their foreign policy and their outlook, they just don't trust and they're just not transparent. So so like there are also conspiracies on how there is a lot of sulfuric acid, like if that is sulfur gas, just spotted by satellite, like radio imaging of satellites over a particular part of China, and that's only possible if you're burning a lot of corpses together.
Yes. I've been reading conspiracy theories to the tune of saying that there are these concentration camps, like Nazi-style concentration camps, where they've essentially been keeping these dead bodies. And even I think some databases of mobile companies came out, and the statistics showed that
they lost
customers have just disappeared.
Millions of subscribers.
Yeah.
So that's just not with COVID, not with COVID victims. They did for Uyghur Muslims, and it was seriously challenging Xi Jinping's authority. So what China has managed to do, and it's not really difficult to believe. Okay, it just depends literally on which side of the bed you wake up on that morning. You can choose to not choose to believe whether China did it as a biochemical weapon, right?
Yeah.
I think it's very much possible that Hong Kong and Uyghur Muslims and the trade war and everything they were being troubled by, they had to silence in one go, right? Including the aging population, and they just managed to like kill all birds with one stone.
Yes.
But yeah, like on the China thing. So they've done a great thing. They've been able to manage themselves in crisis, and also you can almost say they knew what was coming very well because they had a post-COVID strategy. So they imported, produced, took up foreign factories and converted them to produce for state benefit, and they had a massive supply of masks and surgical equipment, ventilators, and there's so many figures out there on how they changed production overnight, and the government was so quickly able to consolidate the industry and mobilize it. And now they're giving to the rest of the world.
Do you think
and so somehow there are... There's an interesting question coming. Conspiracy?
No, so not a conspiracy. You can finish the point, yeah.
Okay. You just see how suddenly there are so many important countries who are indebted to China, including India, who have to take a leaf out of China's book. And like when we thought, like a lot of people are thinking when Modi said we need to learn from other countries who have already responded to the crisis, he meant China. And he just couldn't name China because it was China, and that would be very politically incorrect to say on TV in India. But the way they've tackled it, the idea that they are they are knowledge leaders in how to tackle the crisis is helping them so much. And look at the far-reaching effects. When they're back on, they're gonna have the surplus supply. They're gonna be able to supply everywhere. They're going to be able to supply to the immediate demands that come in. So, for example, compare the tea market in India and China. Right? People who need tea as soon as the crisis is over.
Yeah.
Like when the markets are open again, it's literally a function of them being open or closed. There will be lesser demand as opposed to when it started, perhaps. When we started with the crisis, perhaps. But you can't supply that quickly. Those who couldn't supply these last 3 months can't make up supply overnight. So China is going to be the one moving in and taking over these places. And it already has larger geopolitical reach because there are so many more countries that are going to be perhaps more willing to trade with them.
Exactly. And
China.
And in a way, what is ironic is that China is providing supply for a demand they help create. So it's like
Mm-hmm.
they have created this
Exactly.
market where they
Yeah.
become all the more
Yeah.
valuable by creating a
Mm.
problem that they themselves
Mm.
helped magnify into a
Mm.
global pandemic. So, I mean,
Mm.
they're definitely coming out of
Look
it
at Hong
strong.
Kong.
Yeah.
Yeah, bro, no one's talking about Hong Kong anymore. It's going to be so long. Apparently, before someone's going to talk about Hong Kong,
Hmm.
it's going to be so long. People in Hong Kong are sure enough of themselves, or like confident enough about the health situation to come out and protest like they did.
And
Like they just got everything sorted out for themselves
mm-hmm. Do you
in
think,
one go.
yes, and sort of a follow-up to that, I mean, when the 21st century
Huh?
began, a lot of predictions
Yeah.
were swirling
Hmm.
that this would be the Chinese century. Do you think that
Chinese.
COVID-19
Yeah.
is the catalyst that launches us
No,
towards a
not really.
Sinocentric
Not really.
world?
Not really. A very interesting question. I was thinking of like what I was forgetting to say. This was it.
Yeah.
So remember Suez Canal,
Yes.
right? And how it was the inflection point for when the British hegemony started declining. Not
Mm-hmm.
that it is a sole factor, nothing can be,
Yeah.
but it was literally, if you have to mark an inflection point, you mark the Suez Canal crisis as the inflection point.
Hmm.
I think this can be the inflection point for the the downward curve of the U.S. hegemony, unless
Okay.
the U.S. really pulls some trick out of its hat.
Mm-hmm.
It you can't say whether it's gonna be like the start of a of China as a hegemon,
Hmm.
because there are just too many factors playing out, and it's no longer as simple as you go and invade and you have economic prowess so you can do
Yeah.
better. We're far more connected, and every country is far more ambitious, and rightfully so, as opposed to say the 20th century or even the beginning of the 21st century.
Yes, but at the same time, a potential downturn for the US would leave a power vacuum,
Mm.
which makes it more likely for China to come into the center stage. But then again, as you said, there will be other factors influencing this
Yeah.
as well.
No, why I think so? Look at this one. The simplest way to put it would be, I think a power vacuum which the US creates will need to be filled up by a multitude of forces or international players,
Hmm.
because China is in many ways not a perfect substitute for a lot of peoples around the world for what the US does. Like
Right.
if the US cannot coordinate effort in the West, how likely is it that China, just because it's industrially or in administratively superior, going to suddenly start coordinating efforts in Europe?
Hmm.
So then you start talking about whether it's going to be a clear hegemon in the Orient, but that's also not true, because look, Japan is not going to allow that to happen unless you literally reduce it to 1/10 of the island. And
Hmm.
India is never going to let that happen, and India is
Yes.
no way weakened enough to let China be a clear hegemon. That there's a massive trust gap China has caused within itself. It might have industrially started leading for a long time,
Hmm.
but it caused a massive trust gap. And like normal intercourse, social intercourse, or economic intercourse is going to be very difficult with China for a lot of nations. No, like I don't think traders back in the Hindi heartland, or like the Indian heartland, are going to be able to travel to China with the frequency they did in the last 6 months. Like it's just a red zone. It's like when Mufasa tells Simba that this is the dark part of the kingdom which you can't go to because
Yes.
it's where the hyenas
Hmm.
live.
Hmm.
It's literally that. Like China is going to become that in the psyche of a lot of people around the world, and that's not going to help it. And that's exactly why it can't become a US.
Fair enough. So I think as a
Yeah.
sort of summation on China, we can say that in a post-COVID world, while their
Uh,
infrastructure would be boosted, while they may be economically more powerful, because they lack
mm,
those foundational values that made the United
mm,
States
mm,
create a global hegemony, will mean that a
mm.
Chinese century is still not quite on the horizon in the way that some people might like to think.
Fair, fair,
Okay, great.
fair. It's also because I think somewhere there's an inherent bias in me thinking that,
Hmm.
look, how are we ignoring India? And if
Yes.
I think if we pose this question to like people around the world, they'll respond a lot based on their very localized setting.
Hmm.
Because it's a power question, and like in the absence of me being an expert or an IR person, you have to have some inherent biases in what you want out of your own country, and your like
Yeah, of course.
what your foreign policy outlook is for your own country where you're answering this.
Hmm.
So I just think like China as a hegemon is a very difficult concept for an Indian to buy.
Yeah. All right.
Huh.
Let's talk about the other aspect of a post-COVID-19 world in terms of culture, in
Yeah.
terms of what it means for the common
Uh,
man, for regular everyday activities. Like for instance,
mm,
if I think of Britain, of where I am here at
mm,
Sussex, and
mm,
just about
mm,
a 20-minute
mm,
walk from my room is the football stadium in the Premier League, belonging to Brighton and Hove Albion Football Club. So one of the first
Oh,
images that comes to my mind in a post COVID-19 world, when let's say football resumes or sport resumes, is the fact that people will come out in their hordes and they will gather in their masses, and it will be a sort of celebration of humanity again, a kind of new dawn, so to speak. And how do you see people's mindsets evolving? Of course, I mean, what I just said is something that's not going to happen overnight. Even if, for example, the government miraculously tells tomorrow that the virus has disappeared and the lockdown is over, it's not that people will come out immediately. They will take their time. They'll be skeptical, of course, but it will come to a point where people will start celebrating what it means to have that human touch once again. So what are your feelings? I mean, how do you look at, maybe let's say sometime towards August or September, which I hope will be time enough for the virus to have receded? How do you look at a time like that and think what it would mean to step out again out of your house?
Oh, there's multiple responses. No? I think the first thing which should be addressed there is that there will be no unified response again, because I don't think there is a specific time period within which like different parts of the world or parts of a particular country would declare themselves to be safe or panic free now. And I think it's a very community specific and geography specific and culture specific way in which you respond to like a panic situation. How careful you are, how conservative you're going to be about venturing out. Of course, like, you go back to work and to schools and offices, but how careful you're going to be before you are sure that life is back to normal, and how much time you take to adjust is very different from how an inflation deflation works.
Yeah.
Wherein a immediate injection, the immediate interest rate change is supposed to cause like a psyche change in the taxpayer. Because I think everyone very quickly will, even if say in August or October, we are free of COVID for the time being, the idea of the Spanish flu and how it peaked the year after it actually started is going to be alive in public memory. And even if it doesn't peak in the next year, in the next 15, 20 months, we're all going to be very wary as a planet. So that's going to be a big problem because of the scale in which it has hit us. But yeah, at a very individual level, I think one change is going to happen is an attitudinal change in the way people work.
Right.
Because, for example, the just-in-time supply which people were doing, where like most companies, like a lot of industries, they just keep enough supply or enough quantities or just meet demand enough to tide them over the next week or say like the short run. They're going to start hoarding. Resources are going to be like fought for, distributed in a very different way. Like healthcare is going to boom. So the public discourse is going to change. What people clamor about is going to change. One thing we're sure about is that people can't afford to or won't like naturally have a tendency to remain as distant from the political mainstream as they are. Especially in places like India, there's a lot of people. There are so many who you hear about, who you know, who don't care as much about politics as you or I or someone we know would. That's not going to happen. Because suddenly there's something happened where you and the state have been in direct connect, and it's changed your life, or at least it's been a memorable time period, even if you haven't been directly affected.
Yes. So what you're saying is essentially that people will be sort of jolted out of their apathy, the apathy that they had towards politics, especially over the last few years with the more disillusioning environment developing in the West as well. So I think that's it's a
not really. So I think of course that is one of the benefits, but if you have to say you have to put two prongs to it, right? One is what you just mentioned. A second is it's going to crush these fringe elements and these people who have till now been able to hijack the political talk and take the discourse to pettier directions or for their own purposes. That's going to be so much more difficult to do, because I am not going to tune in to something that discusses why this party and that party didn't do well in the 1960s or the 2005 and petty political rhetoric or nationalism rhetoric at a time when there is a very systemic problem in our administration.
So I think the final thing that I would like to discuss is probably more of a personal thing at a personal level.
Yeah.
So effectively, the only thing that is certain right now is that the virus will be beaten at some point in the future. We don't know when. Perhaps in some cases we don't know how either. But it will be beaten. Maybe, let's say, September, October, whenever it takes for us to sort of venture out again. So what are you most looking forward to in a world without a lockdown? Is there
Uh,
something that you have taken stock of which you want to sort
uh,
of do when
mm,
you come back to normality again?
mm, mm. I want to be able to know that I'm more ready for something like this in the future.
Okay.
Right? I mean this at an individual and at a societal level. I'll tell you why. Let's begin with the individual level, right?
Hmm.
So it was very difficult because so life was very eventful and hectic right before you settled into the lockdown, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, you can adjust to it in multiple ways. One of the things I had to do is change what I was reading. So I just tried it. It seemed like very ludicrous to begin with, but I started reading books from times where there was less technology.
Okay.
So I'm reading Somerset Maugham, and I've gone back to I took up a book by K.M. Munshi called Tapaswini, right? And like things where the settings are slower, where like there are more thoughts, where there's more of a voice speaking through the pages, and stop reading like more of articles and short form journalism and everything which I was reading currently. And I think a lot of perspective comes in when you're forced to do something like this. Of course, it's a luxury to say this, like people are dying, and that's why we have a lockdown.
Exactly.
But
Yes.
for someone to whom it hasn't affected, thankfully yet, uh, I want to be able to use the perspective or the clarity or the many opinions it leaves me with.
Right.
On a societal level, I want the same thing to happen. I want the perspective we've gained to last. I don't want to dissipate. I don't want us to go back to talking about why it's a problem that we don't have Kashmir control over XYZ part of Kashmir. These are problems, right? These are like
Hmm.
undeniably problems and undeniably elephants in the room in the international, like in diplomacy.
Hmm.
But the real politic A needs to change. B, the talk we do needs to change.
No,
And that's
I
something that should
absolutely.
happen. Like, don't let
Yes.
go of the perspective this has brought you.
Yes. And I think it's very important as well for people of our generation, let's say the
Yeah.
ones in our 20s or even those in their early 30s,
Mm-hmm.
because we've been used to a life that's about this hustle culture that you have to constantly keep moving and too much is never enough.
Uh,
And all of these things, like
mm,
even if you look at the way advertising has been done to attract people of our age, in the way
yeah.
our
Yeah.
lives work, from
Mm,
our academics who are
mm,
in academics to
mm,
those who are
mm,
in jobs, it's a life of constant movement where you don't get time to reflect, you don't get time to
mm,
introspect, because
mm,
always there is information that is badgering us, whether it's on
yeah.
Instagram, whether it's
Mm,
on our emails,
mm,
whatever it is. So I think that way what you mentioned about life slowing down
mm,
and giving us perspective
mm,
is really important, because now you've got time
yeah.
to analyze things that you've done. Like I've been
Mm,
doing that. I've been looking at some of, let's say, the major decisions I've made in my life and sort of trying to
mm,
analyze them and second guessing myself. And I think that is important. That gives you
yeah.
that perspective. But equally important is to
Yeah, I,
retain.
I, I read
Yeah.
your article. I read your article on how you're tackling the lockdown. So
Yeah.
we know,
Yes.
what
And
what you were saying is so I got that idea from Sorokin. I forget his name. I think it's Priyam Sorokin, right?
hmm.
He writes like he's written the book. I just chanced across the book, while I was like sitting Reconstruction in Humanity of Humanity.
Okay.
He talks about how advertising and political rhetoric and all those who, when the going is good, are opinion leaders, have such a huge test awaiting them when stuff like an epidemic or a famine or a drought or a war or invasion strikes.
Hmm.
And that is when society ends up with true opinion leaders, and that's going to last for some time.
Yes.
So, like we spoke about, like Modi and his mandate, and
Hmm. Hmm.
Trump and why he doesn't have a mandate, and Russia and China and how the Communist Party came. I think times of reckoning or times when you're facing a test as a society will leave you with just really who really can be an opinion leader.
Hmm.
And petty advertising and stuff that used to move us so easily and appeals to our basest elements and our basest like drive is going to go away.
I think a post COVID-19 world, for those of us who are lucky
Mm.
enough to actually make it into that world,
Yeah.
will be a
Uh,
world where we start sympathizing more with people, because of the fact that
okay.
the human
Okay.
connect that we had established for millennia
Mm-hmm.
as a species, I
Mm-hmm.
think was lost to a great extent. Well, not a great extent, but to a certain extent over the last 10,
Mm-hmm.
15 years, with the rise in social media, with the change in which people were communicating
Mm-hmm.
with one another. And like,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even looking at myself or my friends, we never used to get excited about meeting each other anymore, because you can just call people on video, or you can
Ah,
just
yeah.
text them on
Mm,
WhatsApp. But that revival will happen.
mm,
That revival of just meeting
mm,
somebody, speaking
mm.
at them and looking at their eyes while you're speaking, having body
Oh,
language as a means of
mm,
communication rather than just emojis on WhatsApp. So all of those things I think will
mm,
get revived. So in a way, it's a return to
mm,
what we used to do, and perhaps what we should have retained, and we couldn't because our
mm.
social fabric got changed. And hopefully those things will
Right.
return once we make our way into the post COVID
Yeah.
19 world,
I just
whenever that
realized
is. Yeah.
th- this is the way we like. This is the first question you asked me, and I should have responded by saying I'm going to love meeting my friends again. I just made myself sound very wonderfully, like happily isolated, which I shouldn't have, because I can
Yes.
get a lot of backlash for that. But fair, like that. So that for me too.
Yes, absolutely. All right, I think on that note
Huh.
we'll end this call, and hopefully we'll
Yep.
have other discussions in the future that keep us entertained in this
Yeah.
time of crisis.
Hi, guys. Thank you for listening to the first episode of That's What We Said. The idea for this podcast series really came out of the blue. Ved and I were on call one day, and we suddenly thought, why not share what we are discussing with others? Because we feel a lot of you have been thinking about similar things and have opinions on these matters as well. Ved and I will be doing more episodes of That's What We Said, and we'd love to listen to your feedback and suggestions, so please put them in the comment section. Take care, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.